Good morning. We're in the middle of a series called The Lies We Believe. This morning's lie we look at is strong Christians forgive and forget. What we'll say right off the bat, forgive and forget doesn't work. When somebody wrongs us and the hurt is deep, our brain locks the memory in place. And whether we want to remember that thing or not, when we feel similar feelings or in the middle of just doing something else, the memory hits our brain. We didn't ask for it to come back. It just comes back when we're asleep at night. And we wake up and this thought is in our brain about what somebody did to us. We didn't wake up to be able to think about it. It just happened. And it seems that our brain seems to take these memories and stick them into our brain with extra strength glue because they're hard to lose. We remember it again and again, and the feelings wash over us again. In fact, that's what resentment means, literally. The word resentment means to feel it all over again. And that's the problem with resentment. We feel it all over again. The resentment comes, the thoughts come, and we feel the feelings that we felt before. Addiction, then, any kind of addiction, is the futile attempt to put distance between ourselves and these memories through the use of mood-altering experiences and chemicals. And really what addiction is about, I don't want to think about that thing anymore. I don't want to think about what I don't have. I don't want to think about what I don't do. I don't want to think about what that person did. And so what we do is we move into a relationship with a mood-altering substance. Great, I don't think of it when I'm loaded. Or I don't think about it when I'm doing this or that thing. And the problem with addiction is not that it doesn't work. It does work for as long as you're buzzed. But then the effects of that mood-altering substance or experience wear off, and there it is again, back again, bubbling to the surface. And forgive and forget is the equally futile attempt to suppress these memories through force of will, to try to make ourselves forget something. We end up submerging these memories. And the problem with submerging things is that we end up becoming pretty driven about something. If we want to forget something, what we end up doing is we try to keep our brain so occupied that these even have space to come out. That we keep our mind so active, we become driven about something, and we throw ourselves into things. And I bet you that's why it's hard for us some of us have a really difficult time with quiet. We always have to be listening to something. We always have to be watching something, reading something, doing something. It's very difficult for some of us for our minds to be unoccupied. I don't wonder. You know what I think part of that's about? If our mind is unoccupied, guess what floats to the surface? Those thoughts we don't want to think about. I don't want to think about what that person did. I don't want to think about what I don't have. And so we keep our brain occupied. What does this have to do with forgiveness? I think resentment is an indicator that we are running low on forgiveness. Resentment is an indicator that we're running low on forgiveness. Now, before we go any further, some of you are saying, okay, then resentment's bad. I won't do it. Yes, you will. You don't have the power not to resent. I guess that's what I'm saying. Resentment is irresistible. Resentment is automatic. Your brain will record and remind you of things that somebody did to you that you didn't like. You don't have the option to receive what you can do is you can choose how to respond to it. You can't choose whether you'll respond. You can only choose how. There's a couple things that we do with resentment that are fairly common. When we feel resentful feelings, we react in one of two ways. We blame ourselves or blame others. And this is a response that's not all that helpful, but it's one that we do. We blame ourselves or blame others, and chronic blame becomes contempt. Chronic blame becomes contempt. When you continue to blame yourself and over and over again because of things that you don't have, what will happen? It will become not just a instance, it will become a character. It will become a habit. You'll think of yourself as a contemptuous person. And if we were to turn up and expose outside the inner thoughts, the inner things we say to ourselves, it wouldn't be very pretty. Some of us blame ourselves, and what we say to ourselves is not pretty at all. Some of us, we don't blame ourselves, we blame others, and our blame becomes contemptuous. It's not that we really want to hate that person. We cannot not hate them. It's like these things bubble up and we find ourselves exploding. And where does that come from? I think it comes from responding to resentment. The envy, resentment becomes infected and hateful. We resent what happened. We blame ourselves and others for what happened. And chronic blame becomes contempt. This morning I will encourage you to approach these memories. Now, we're not going to approach them all this morning. But I will encourage you not to forget these memories. And I will tell you to forgive and forget is dangerous. It will end up burying something, and that memory is going to come out, but you'll have no choice about when. It'll come out sideways. It'll come out in every one of a number of ways. Don't forgive and forget. I'm not going to lay a should on you. We're going to talk about God's forgiveness, and that's not going to be God forgave you, you should forgive others. That doesn't work either. We're not that powerful. But there are some things that we can do. There is a how to approach resentment, and there is a how to forgiveness, and that's what we'll talk about. But to get there, we have to start with the root of God's forgiveness. Look what it says in your worship folder in Jeremiah 31. It's going to talk about a covenant. We talk about covenants. A covenant is a treaty or decree. It's when a governing body decides to do something. Sometimes it is a we'll do this or you do that. Sometimes government does that. Sometimes government just makes a decision. Here's what we're going to do. Boink. And a covenant is then a governmental treaty or decree. Let's see what God determines that His government is going to do. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God and they will be my people. No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sin no more. When God says, this is the covenant I will make with them, and then He goes to say at the end of that covenant, I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sins no more. This is a decision that is not driven by feelings. And again, I think this is really important because the root of God's forgiveness becomes the root of our forgiveness. And I think what we need to know is when God says, I forgive you, it's not because He has a tear in His eye. God is very clear-headed when He gives forgiveness because it's something He does as a part of a covenant, a decree, a decision. It's not driven by feelings. God doesn't forgive you because He feels like it. God forgives you because He chooses to. Because that's the way He will run His government. And He will say, you have done things and I choose, God says, to forgive you. There are no ifs. Sometimes covenants are bilateral. And by bilateral I mean that there's something both sides need to do. And usually bilateral covenants contain the word if. And that makes sense, right? If you do this, then I will do this. And if I government and I enter into a bilateral covenant contract treaty with you, I'll say, if you do this, I'll do this. And if I do this, you do that. This covenant, though, when you look at it, let's read it again. And you shout out when you see the word if. Now, you loud when you see if. This is the covenant I will make with the house of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. Any ifs? Any ifs at all yet? I didn't hear anybody yelling. I will be their God. They will be my people. Any ifs there? No longer will a man teach his neighbor or a man his brother, saying, know the Lord, because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more. Are there any ifs? Did you see any? You know what kind of covenant this is? This is not bilateral, it's unilateral. It's God saying, you don't have to do anything. Here's what I am going to do. Not because I feel bad or not because I feel sad, but because I choose to. Again, forgiveness is not based on God's feelings. It's based on decisions He makes. The image that God doesn't forgive, that sin. You know the sin I'm talking about. The sin that you struggle with. That sin. The sense that God does not forgive that sin. It might feel noble at one level. Oh, God couldn't forgive that. You know what it is? It is arrogant. If God says, I forgive that, who are you to doubt Him? Now, I'm not blowing you. You understand what I mean, though? Because sometimes we beat ourselves up and think that's noble and thinks that God looks at us and flailing ourselves and says, oh, I really like it when you don't believe that I forgive you. God doesn't like it. And some of you need to be maybe a little bit more stern with yourself when that part of you that whimpers and says, oh, He could never forgive me. Maybe you need to tell yourself, stop it. If God says you're forgiven, not to believe Him is arrogant. You understand? I'm not mad. But sometimes we need to be stern with ourselves. Believe what God says. There's no ifs, ands, or buts here. Right? I guess the choice is you can believe it or not. Now, all of us have a difficult time believing it. And you're saying, Mike, I have a hard time believing it. Yep, I'm with you. But that's what we need to do. God has not stumbled or stuttered in what He has said. And He wants us to believe it. I'm so bad He'll never forgive me. I'm going to challenge some of you. When you sin, don't add one sin to another. When you do something wrong and add to the sin that you committed, the sin of unbelief, it's like double-decker sin. Don't do that. And if you do something wrong, I challenge you not to let yourself go in the direction of now not only am I going to do that wrong thing, I'm now going to add to it the sin of unbelief. Oh, God, you must hate me. And where do we get that? That's not from God. The fruit, you might say, okay, Mike, so I'm forgiven. So what good is that? How will that help me change my life? You know, forgiveness, okay, fine, but there's behaviors that I'm doing and there's resentment that's eating me up. You know what they say about resentment? Resentment is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. And a lot of us know what that's like. We feel eaten up by it. And the resentment, we pour bile all over ourselves or others. How can we deal with that? There are some things that, well, look what it says in Jeremiah 32. And here's the fruit of God's forgiveness. The root is, God says there's a new covenant in His blood. No ifs in that covenant. Let's read this. It says, they will be my people and I will be their God. I will give them, and you know what this is? This is the fruit of God's forgiveness. So if God says, I forgive you, these are the things that are true because God has decided to forgive. Okay? They will be my people, I will be their God. I will give them singleness of heart and action, so that they will always fear me for their own good and the good of their children after them. I will make an everlasting covenant with them. I will never stop doing good to them, and I will inspire them to fear me, so that they will never turn away from me. I think that if we look at it then, the fruit of forgiveness is this. God says, I am in you. I will put my law in your mind and write it on your heart. It says, I am with you. I will be your God and you will be my person. He says, good is ahead of you. I will make an everlasting covenant with them. I will never stop doing good to them. I will rejoice in doing them good. And He says this is guaranteed, because He will forgive our wickedness and remember our sin no more. Now, these things are true because God made a decision to forgive. And because He made a decision to forgive, that is the root of forgiveness, and this is the fruit of forgiveness. God makes these promises to you and says, I am in you, and I am with you, and good is ahead of you, and that's guaranteed because I will forgive your wickedness and remember your sin no more. And that decision wasn't based on feelings. The fruit of God's forgiveness means these promises apply. Sin keeps promises from being offered. If sin is forgiven, then nothing prevents promises from being applicable. No one is able to cut you off from God's good promises. Here's where it gets tough. And again, this is not easy. What I'm suggesting is a long road, but it is the truth. The fruit of God's forgiveness is this. No matter where you are, no matter what somebody did to you or what you did, God says, well, you could say, and to believe that would mean to say to God, you are still in me. Why would you believe that? Because God made a decree. It wasn't based on feelings. It was a decision. The fruit of that forgiveness is that there are promises to you that are bulletproof, that are unilateral. And then to believe that believes you are still in me. You are still with me. Even though that person walked away, even though that person did that bad thing, you are still with me. And good is still ahead of me. That person doesn't like me. I don't know if I'm going to save my job. I don't know how my kids are going to turn out. God says, I have made promises to you. And what it would mean to believe would be to say, you're still in me. And you're still with me. And good's still ahead of me. Wait a minute, time out, Mike. You don't know what I did last night. Yeah, I did that sin again. And that makes all these promises null and void. Does it? If God says, I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sin no more. Now I want you to listen to what He says. I will forgive their wickedness and remember their sin no more. What part of that is difficult to understand? Are there any ifs in that? Is there any double talk? You know what that means? Guaranteed. Do you understand that? God is still in you. God is still with you. Good is still ahead of you. Guaranteed. The fruit of God's forgiveness becomes the root of our forgiveness. This is the truth. If all these promises are true, that is the root from which you'll be able to find the ability to forgive. Because you know what? What that person did was not able to cause God to take His promises back. And it was painful what they did and what they do. And it didn't feel good. I'm not saying that it feels good. I'm saying what they did was not able to cause God to change His covenant. That's what I'm saying. So what do you mean? Well, no matter where you are, and no matter what they did, or what you did, the truth is, and you can say this to God, again, this is not just hypnosis, it's the truth. You can say to Him, in fact, you might try to mouth these words to Him. I'd encourage you to memorize this, and to say it, you're still in me. You're still with me. Good is still ahead of me. Guaranteed. Why? Because God made a decision, and the decision involves you. I'm not saying that things, when God says good is ahead of you, those things won't feel good. God will not allow your life to be a cloud nine. Jesus had a nail in the flesh. Paul had a thorn in the flesh. There's going to be things that are going to be difficult and painful. But it's not because you did anything wrong, and it's not because He's punishing you. To punish you, He'd have to hold your sin over your head, and He's not doing that. What it means is this: even when lousy things happen and people cut you off in traffic, and you don't get the parking spot right in front of Walmart, that person zipped right in front of you, and you don't even have to try to find the lesson. Oh, I know what you're trying to teach me. You're trying to teach me to walk. Oh, I get it. Sometimes we try to outthink God and try to figure out, what are you trying to teach me? Stop it. You can't track with Him. But what you can know is, okay, I didn't get the parking spot, but you know what? As I'm driving back to the back 40, I'm over by Brandon at this point. You're still in me. You're still with me. Good still ahead of me. Guaranteed. Can you say that even though you have to park in Brandon? Can you say that? Can you say that even though your boss is not treating you well? Can you say that even though you might lose your job? Can you say that even though your marriage is not what you want it to be? Your kids aren't who you want them to be. Is God still in you? Is God still with you? Is good still ahead of you? And is that guaranteed? And the answer is yes. And that is both the fruit of God's forgiveness and the root of our forgiveness. There's an example from the Bible that it's one that we know well, and it's fun to think about. Look in your worship folder, talk about Joseph. You know what happened to Joseph? I'm not going to tell the story. His brothers jealous of him. Joseph has this connection with God that he didn't ask for, but that was there. God said, I'm going to do special things through you. Joseph made the mistake of telling his brothers that, and they didn't like it. And Joseph's dad gave him a special code, and they didn't like that. And so they found the opportunity to throw him in a pit. They were going to leave him for dead, but then they fished him out of the pit, sold him to Ishmaelites, and sold him into slavery. And then through this long process, prison, distance from home, he ends up becoming second in command in Egypt, second to Pharaoh. There's a famine. His brothers come trying to find food. Egypt's the only place for food. Joseph sends them on some missions. They don't understand who he is. He doesn't look like Joseph. And they had tried to forget. Look what it says in Genesis 45, verse 4. Joseph said to his brothers, come close to me. When they had done so, he said, I'm your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now, do not be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because I forget what you did. Isn't that a nice story? I can't even think of it. Where did you throw me? Was that a pit? I don't even remember. I forgave and forgot. Yeah, I think there was some bumps along the way, but yeah, I'm a Christian and I forgive and forget. That's ridiculous. Of course he remembered what happened. Goes on, it says, now don't be distressed and do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on the earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So, then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Would you agree? This is not forgive and forget forgiveness. This is something better. It's something he sees and he doesn't avert his eyes from what happened. But what he sees does not cause bile to rise up in his throat. How does that happen? He looks at their behavior without seeing red. How does that happen? How does he have a memory without the poison of resentment? How does he have a memory without hating the person who did this to them? That's a good question, isn't it? Joseph looked at his brothers bad. He didn't forget it. He didn't get amnesia about it. What he did see, he looked straight ahead and said, I see what you did. I don't want to point at anybody because he's pointing at me. I know I did. I knew he knew. Okay, yeah. Looked straight at him and said, you meant it for evil. And I don't forget that, but he meant it for good. And that's why I can remember you and what you did without bile rising in my throat, because God's good trumped your bad. That's why he didn't have to have the resentment. He believed and he experienced God's good trumped your bad. It's not that you didn't mean it. You did mean it. It's not that you made a mistake. You made a mistake, but it was willful. But I am not incarcerated by your bad, because his good trumps your bad. And he knew about your bad, but he turned that into his good. He recycled it. And that's why I can think about what you did and maybe not let you off the hook. I'm going to send you on some journeys because you need to learn a lesson. But you know what the thing that I think about when I see this? When Joseph sent his brothers on those journeys, it wasn't to make himself feel better. Oh, that makes me feel better. I hope their feet burn on the way. You know, that's resentment, trying to find a sense of relief from seeing other people suffer or seeing ourselves suffer. Sometimes we turn our hate inside. We do terrible things to ourselves or to others. You know why? We actually believe that what somebody did to us has the ability to keep God's good promises from being realized in our life. Or we think that what we can do keeps God's promises from. Can anybody do something to you that will cause God not to be in you, with you, good not ahead of you, guaranteed? Good ahead of you, guaranteed? Anything you can do? Joseph believed that God's good trumped their bad, and that's what took the venom out, and his good won the day. Now, Joseph believed because of what he saw. He saw silos filled with grain, and he saw his brothers standing there. We don't all get to see that. We'd like to, but we don't. We need to believe because of what God says. And look what it says. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God?" Genesis 50. "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then, don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children." And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. What Joseph was able to do, he was able to look at what his brothers did and know that God's good trumped their bad. He was able to say, God meant it for good. Now, you know what good means? Good in the context. Well, in fact, if you have a pencil, look at that verse. God intended it for good. You want to underline something? Underline that. Okay, I'm in Genesis 50, second line. Joseph said to them, "Don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." God intended it for good. What does good mean in God's dictionary? And it's going to define what good means in the next sentence. And it's not going to be because Joseph got what will make him feel good. Joseph didn't get what he wanted, at least not within this time frame. Ultimately, he did. Well, look what it says. God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. In God's dictionary, when you look at good, it's something that will contribute to the saving of many lives. And what Joseph was able to say, and he looked at what his brothers did and said, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good. Not just good for me, good for all these people around me. So many lives have been saved. That's why Joseph was able to forgive his brothers. God's good trumped their bad. He ended up being a part of a plan that enabled many lives to be saved. What is the fruit of our forgiveness? People do things, and we feel resentful because ultimately we believe that what they did has the power to make our lives not good. And what God would have you understand is this. He makes promises to you, and He says, "I am in you, and I am with you, and good's ahead of you, guaranteed." What you do and what they do cannot cause these promises to be rescinded. They can't. When that starts to get inside the fruit of our forgiveness, we are able to turn towards people. Now, the reason why I like this picture, this is not a really happy thing. I'm not sure what happened between these people. But they're not jumping up and down, but they're connecting with one another. They're working things through. The fact is, when you forgive somebody, you're not going to act as if nothing happened, because something did happen. You're not going to throw your arms around them maybe and be best buddies, because you can't trust them. But what you will do is understand, even though you meant it for evil, your evil cannot keep me from experiencing His good, and that will enable you to breathe and turn toward them. When you love somebody, sometimes you enable them to experience the consequences of their choices. There's no one that loved more perfectly than Jesus Christ. He loved perfectly. Did Jesus always make people smile? Did Jesus upset people? Absolutely He did. Sometimes loving people means allowing them to be upset. How do I know that? Jesus loved perfectly. And He never did an unloving thing to anyone, but He told people the truth. Now again, it's tricky. We looked at a book, and I'm going to recommend a book that's good fodder for this, Bold Love by Dan Allender. And if you want to read a book that will help you understand, or at least raise questions about, what does it mean to love a fool? How really do you love a person that believes that they can berate and anger you into doing whatever they want you to do? What does it mean to love that person? To lie down and let them walk all over you? No, that's not loving them. It's not loving them. When you forgive somebody, it gives you the wherewithal to love them. But loving them might mean making them very uncomfortable. But here's the deal. You won't make them uncomfortable to make yourself feel better. It won't be, okay then. And that's the beauty of it. You can actually love them because you can think about what really would be best for you. And the reason why you do that is because you know that what they did, again, can't cause God to rescind His promises. Again, this is not simple. It's not easy. I'm going to call the worship team up. And as they're filing up, if they're good, they're bad didn't remove God's good, in one sense, you can let them off the hook. They did not wreck your life. They couldn't wreck your life because what they did has no power relative to making God rescind His promises. The foundation of forgiveness is understanding that God makes promises to you. He promises to forgive you. And the fruit of God's forgiveness, those promises, is the root of your forgiveness of others. Because you can say you're in with goods ahead, guaranteed, and if that's true, what they did has no power. And what this might mean, maybe we can do some business. And it might mean that rather than try to forget what that person did, you might have to look at it. I'm not saying confront the person right away. Again, Bold Love is a good book if you want some practical things. For some of you, the person that wronged you is dead. And it might be a visit to the cemetery. And it might be to sit down in front of a stone and not forget. Let the memories come. But then remember what He said to you. Him. I am still in you. And I'm still with you. And good's still ahead of you. Guaranteed. And let that be the root of your forgiveness. And you can speak to that stone and say, you meant it for evil. But He meant it for good to accomplish what's being now. Since His good trumped your bad, I let you off the hook. Some of you, it's a face-to-face confrontation. I'm not saying you'd say this to the person, but the spirit with which you come, you can approach conflict because His forgiveness is the root of ours. Let's pray. Gosh, God, I think that you confront us with things today that really strike. You tell us about promises that are very difficult for us to believe. And you would have us move towards believing them. You would have us understand that your promises are bulletproof. They're not based in feeling. They are in the rock of decree. And therefore they are unshakable. You say you put your law in our mind and write it on our heart. You're our God, you're our people. You will cause us to know you, and you'll forgive our wickedness and remember our sin no more. I'd ask that you would give us increasing capacity to believe what you say rather than what we feel. We don't feel forgiven. You don't tell us you'll give us feelings. You tell us you'll give us facts. And those facts make things true. What they did could not cause you to rescind your promises. What we do can't cause that to happen. You would have us believe right now, where we are, in the middle of our turbulence, that you are in us. And that you are with us and good is ahead of us, guaranteed. No one can change those realities. Because no one can change your covenant. So I guess, God, give us the ability, an increasing way, to believe it, because the fruit of this belief will allow us to move and approach others, not forgiving and forgetting, remembering and forgiving, and moving into their lives lovingly and maybe even carefrontingly. Teach us about this so that we can be more like Jesus. In His name, amen. Next week we'll look at strong Christians gain victory over fear, anger, and depression. J.C. Chambers will help us.